The wheelchair stopped rolling. Sarah's hands, steady as a surgeon's for 18 months of marriage, trembled as they released the brake on the cliff's edge. Duke's desperate bark shattered the morning silence of Eagle's Peak, a sound that would haunt the Blue Ridge Mountains forever. It wasn't supposed to be a romantic anniversary trip. It was an execution. The German shepherd lunged forward, claws scraping against Virginia stone, but physics had already claimed its victim. Metal wheels spun uselessly in mountain air as William Thompson plummeted 200 feet toward the jagged rocks below. Sarah stood frozen, watching her husband disappear into the mist. The man who had trusted her with his morning pills, his evening meals, his very life. Maggie Thompson would find the empty wheelchair in 6 hours, still warm from her son's body. She'd remember ignoring Duke's growling for months, dismissing it as jealousy. "Call 911, he's missing!" Sarah would scream into her phone, tears streaming down cheeks that had practiced this moment in bathroom mirrors. Who survives a 200-foot fall? And why was the dog already climbing down after him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, William Bill Thompson had rolled into the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Richmond, believing his life was over. At 39, the former Army Staff Sergeant carried invisible wounds deeper than the spinal injury that had stolen his legs during a training accident at Fort Bragg. The explosion had been quick, a faulty grenade during a routine exercise, but the aftermath stretched like an endless winter. That's where he met Sarah Elizabeth Morgan, an ICU nurse with gentle hands and a smile that seemed to understand suffering. She was 35 then, with auburn hair always pulled back in a practical bun and scrubs that somehow looked elegant on her tall frame. Sarah had spent 12 years caring for broken soldiers, and Bill wasn't her first veteran patient to fall in love with her kindness. "You're stronger than you think," she'd whispered during those early rehabilitation sessions, her fingers steady as she adjusted his IV drip. "I've seen men with working legs who couldn't walk half as far as you will." The courtship was swift by Bill's standards, though his mother Maggie warned it felt rushed. 6 months of hospital visits became dinner dates, then weekend trips to the Thompson family cabin nestled in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The property had belonged to his family for 4 generations, a modest log structure that had once served as a station on the Underground Railroad. His great-great-grandfather had built it with his own hands, and every Thompson man since had added their own improvements. Sarah seemed enchanted by the history, running her fingers along the original stone chimney and asking endless questions about the family legacy. The cabin sat on 200 acres of pristine mountain land, worth nearly $3 million according to the latest county assessment, a fortune for a disabled veteran living on $4,200 monthly disability payments. Duke had been Bill's constant companion for 2 years before Sarah entered their lives. The German Shepherd arrived through the VA's service dog program, a 7-year-old veteran himself who'd served 2 tours detecting explosives in Afghanistan. Duke understood commands in both English and Pashto, could sense Bill's anxiety attacks before they peaked, and had never left his side for more than 30 minutes since their pairing. But Duke had never trusted Sarah. From their first meeting, the dog positioned himself between them, ears alert, amber eyes tracking her every movement. Sarah laughed it off as jealousy, calling Duke our protective little guardian, while privately complaining about dog hair on the furniture and paw prints on her clean floors. Bill's mother Maggie, now 71 and sharp as the mountain air she'd breathed her entire life, lived in the smaller guest cabin 50 yards from the main house. She'd raised Bill alone after his father died when the boy was 12, a hunting accident, she'd always said, though neighbors whispered about Robert Thompson's drinking and violent temper. Maggie had worked 2 jobs to keep the land in the family, and she watched Sarah with the careful eyes of a woman who'd learned to spot trouble before it took root. The wedding was small, held on the cabin's wraparound porch with Duke serving as unofficial ring-bearer. 6 months into their marriage, Sarah Elizabeth Thompson began her careful campaign of concern. It started with small observations delivered in her professional nurse's voice. Bill looked pale, seemed tired, wasn't eating enough. She'd place a cool hand on his forehead during breakfast, frown with practiced worry, and suggest he needed more vitamins, better nutrition, stronger supplements to boost his weakened immune system. Duke noticed first. The German Shepherd's behavior shifted subtly, positioning himself between Sarah and Bill's meals, nose twitching with suspicion whenever she approached the kitchen. At first, Bill dismissed it as territorial behavior. Duke had always been protective, and adjusting to a new family member took time. But the dog's wariness grew more pronounced each week. "He's been acting strange lately," Bill mentioned to his mother during one of Maggie's daily visits. The 71-year-old woman sat on the porch, snapping green beans from her garden while Duke lay at her feet, unusually restless. "Strange how?" Maggie's weathered hands never paused in their work, but her pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Won't eat when Sarah's around. Yesterday he knocked my coffee cup right out of my hands when she brought it to me, spilled all over my lap." Maggie glanced down at Duke, who was staring intently at the main cabin's kitchen window where Sarah could be seen preparing lunch. "That dog's got more sense than most people I know. Maybe you should pay attention to what he's telling you." The dizzy spells began 3 weeks later. Bill would wake feeling disoriented, his vision blurry and thoughts scattered like morning fog. Sarah expressed appropriate wifely concern, taking his blood pressure, checking his temperature, insisting he needed to see a specialist. The episodes always seemed to follow his morning routine: coffee with Sarah, breakfast together, his daily vitamins administered with her characteristic efficiency. "I think you need a new doctor," Sarah suggested one October morning after Bill had nearly blacked out during his physical therapy session. "Someone who understands traumatic brain injury better. I know an excellent neurologist in Richmond, Dr. Nathan Pierce. We worked together at the hospital." Dr. Pierce was younger than Bill expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair and expensive glasses that suggested a successful practice. His examination was thorough, his manner professional yet warm. He ordered blood tests, brain scans, a comprehensive neurological workup that found nothing definitively wrong but plenty to worry about. "Delayed trauma response," Dr. Pierce explained during their second appointment, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. "Sometimes the brain takes years to fully process severe injuries. We're seeing more of this in veterans, what we call latent neurological deterioration." Bill left with prescriptions for 3 new medications and instructions to return monthly for monitoring. Sarah seemed relieved to have professional validation for her concerns, though Maggie noted privately that her daughter-in-law's relief looked suspiciously like satisfaction. The real shift came during Thanksgiving dinner. Bill had invited his old Army buddy Jake Morrison and his wife Carol, along with Maggie and Sarah, for what should have been a celebration. Sarah had spent days preparing, cooking Bill's favorite dishes, and decorating the dining room with autumn leaves and family photos. Duke refused to come inside. The normally social dog planted himself on the front porch, whining and pawing at the door but refusing to cross the threshold. When Bill tried to coax him in, Duke backed away, tail tucked, eyes fixed on Sarah with unmistakable wariness. "What's gotten into him?" Carol asked, trying to pet Duke through the screen door. "He's always been such a friendly boy." "I think he's jealous of Sarah," Bill said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Still adjusting to sharing me, I guess." During dinner, Bill excused himself to use the bathroom and returned to find Duke in the kitchen, having somehow gotten inside. The dog was methodically knocking pill bottles off the counter, scattering Bill's medications across the tile floor, while Sarah stood frozen in the doorway. "Duke, no. Bad dog." Sarah's voice was sharp with genuine anger. "Look what you've done." But as Bill watched his service dog carefully select certain pills, the new ones Dr. Pierce had prescribed, and carry them outside to bury in the garden. A cold understanding began to settle in his chest. Duke had been trained to detect dangerous substances. His behavior wasn't jealousy or confusion. It was a warning. That night, Bill lay awake listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside him, her phone charging on the nightstand. When she slipped into deep sleep, he carefully reached for the device, heart pounding as he scrolled through her recent calls. The number appeared 17 times in the past month, always after his medical appointments. Dr. Nathan Pierce called at 11:47 p.m. just 3 hours earlier. The confrontation came during the first snowfall of December, when the Blue Ridge Mountains wrapped themselves in pristine white and the Thompson family cabin looked like something from a Christmas card. Bill had spent 3 weeks documenting Sarah's late-night phone calls, photographing the pills Duke kept stealing, and quietly researching Dr. Nathan Pierce's background. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Pierce had been investigated twice for insurance fraud in neighboring states. Both cases had been dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the pattern was unmistakable. Elderly patients and disabled veterans experiencing sudden neurological episodes under his care. Bill's hand shook as he read news reports about 3 veterans who had died of complications while under Pierce's treatment in West Virginia and Maryland. The morning Bill planned to confront Sarah, Maggie arrived earlier than usual, her face grim with purpose. She clutched a manila folder against her chest like armor, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she maneuvered her way through the snow-covered pathway. "We need to talk," she said simply, settling into the kitchen chair across from where Bill sat drinking his morning coffee. Coffee Sarah had prepared, but Duke had deliberately knocked over when his owner wasn't looking. Maggie opened the folder and spread its contents across the wooden table. Bank statements, insurance documents, property deeds, and medical records created a damning mosaic of evidence. "I've been doing some digging of my own," she said, her voice carrying the steel of a woman who'd survived 7 decades of mountain life. The insurance policy was the centerpiece, a $2 million life insurance policy on Bill's life, taken out 6 months after their wedding. Sarah was the sole beneficiary. Attached to it were documents showing a systematic transfer of assets, with Sarah gradually gaining control over Bill's disability payments, his veteran benefits, and even partial ownership of the family land. "She's been planning this for months," Maggie whispered, pointing to highlighted sections of legal documents. "Look at this. She's already contacted 3 different real estate developers about selling the property, has meetings scheduled for next week." Bill's vision blurred, not from his mysterious medical episodes, but from the crushing weight of betrayal. The woman he'd trusted with his medications, his meals, his vulnerable heart, had been systematically poisoning him while planning to inherit everything he owned. "There's more," Maggie continued, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger. "I talked to Martha Henderson down at the county clerk's office. Sarah's been married before, twice. Both husbands died within 2 years of marriage. Both had substantial insurance policies. The kitchen door opened with its familiar creak, and Sarah entered carrying grocery bags, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked beautiful in her red wool coat, snowflakes melting in her auburn hair, smiling with the warmth that had first captured Bill's heart. For a moment, he wondered if they were wrong, if love had made him paranoid and suspicious. Then he saw her eyes fix on the document spread across the table, watched her face transform from loving wife to calculating predator in the span of a heartbeat. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, but her knuckles white as she gripped the grocery bags. "The truth," Bill said quietly. "About Dr. Pierce. About the insurance. About what you've been putting in my food." Sarah set the bags down carefully, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but 3 veterans in 2 states," Maggie interrupted, her voice sharp as winter wind, "all died under mysterious circumstances while being treated by your boyfriend. All had wives who inherited substantial amounts of money. The word boyfriend hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her composure cracked just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're a senile old woman who sees conspiracies everywhere. Am I? Maggie pulled out her phone, fingers shaking slightly as she navigated to her recording app. Because I've been documenting your late-night phone calls for weeks. Sarah's voice filled the kitchen, tinny but unmistakable through the phone's speaker. Nathan, he's getting suspicious. The dog keeps interfering with the medication. We need to move faster. Yes, I understand the risks, but the insurance won't pay out if it looks suspicious. Maybe we should consider an accident. The recording continued for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Sarah's voice discussing dosages, timing, and the best way to make Bill's death appear natural. When it ended, the silence in the kitchen was deafening, except for the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Sarah's mask finally slipped completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising with desperation. I've given up everything for this family. My career, my independence, my future. I deserve something in return. You deserve a husband who loves you, Bill said, his voice breaking. I gave you that. I gave you everything I had. Everything you had was broken, Sarah screamed, the words exploding out of her like poison finally finding release. A crippled man in a falling-down cabin with a senile mother and a dog that hates me. This isn't the life I wanted. This isn't what I signed up for. Duke appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the raised voices, his amber eyes fixed on Sarah with unmistakable recognition. The German shepherd's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, his body tense and ready. For months, he'd been trying to protect his family from a threat they couldn't see. Now that threat stood exposed in their kitchen, desperate and dangerous. Get out, Bill said quietly. Pack your things and leave. Now. Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You think it's that simple? You think you can just dismiss me? She pulled her phone from her pocket, fingers flying across the screen. Nathan's already on his way. We've planned for this contingency. Through the kitchen window, they could see a black sedan making its way slowly up the snow-covered driveway, Dr. Pierce behind the wheel. Sarah's backup plan was already in motion. Dr. Nathan Pierce stepped out of his sedan into the December snow, his expensive Italian shoes slipping slightly on the icy driveway. Through the kitchen window, Bill watched the man who had been slowly poisoning him approach the cabin with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting away with murder. Pierce carried a black medical bag, the kind old-fashioned doctors used for house calls, though Bill suspected this visit would be anything but therapeutic. He's here to finish what we started, Sarah said, her voice now devoid of any pretense of love or care. Nathan has a way of making heart attacks look very natural in disabled veterans. Something about the stress of chronic pain and PTSD. Maggie stood slowly, her 71-year-old frame straightening with the dignity of a mountain woman who'd faced down bears, blizzards, and heartbreak. Over my dead body, she said simply, moving toward the gun cabinet where her late husband's hunting rifle had waited unused for 30 years. That can be arranged, Sarah replied, pulling a small pistol from her purse, a .38 special that looked almost delicate in her nurse's hands. Nathan thought we might need this. He's very thorough in his planning. Duke's growl filled the kitchen, low and menacing, his hackles raised as he positioned himself between the women and his paralyzed master. The German shepherd's training kicked in. Protect, assess, respond. His amber eyes tracked between Sarah's weapon and the approaching threat outside. Bill's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. His wheelchair left him vulnerable. Maggie was unarmed and outnumbered. And Duke, despite his loyalty and training, couldn't stop bullets. The cabin that had sheltered 4 generations of Thompsons was about to become their tomb. The front door opened without ceremony, Doctor. Pierce entered like he owned the place, shaking snow from his coat and setting his medical bag on the entrance table with practiced ease. "Sarah, darling," I could hear raised voices from outside. "I trust our patient isn't being difficult about his treatment?" "They know," Sarah said flatly. "The old woman's been recording phone calls. They have evidence." Pierce's expression didn't change, but his hand moved casually toward his coat pocket. "How unfortunate. Well, I suppose we'll need to adjust our timeline. Heart attacks can be very sudden in veterans. The emotional stress of confronting traumatic memories, you understand." "You won't get away with this," Bill said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "My friend Jake Morrison knows about the medication problems. The VA has copies of all my medical records." "People will ask questions." "People ask questions when young, healthy individuals die suddenly," Pierce replied, approaching with the clinical detachment of a man discussing the weather. "When disabled veterans with documented psychological issues and chronic pain have cardiac episodes, well, that's just tragedy. Natural, inevitable tragedy." Maggie moved faster than anyone expected, her weathered hand surprising Pierce as she grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with the force of decades spent splitting firewood. The impact sent Pierce stumbling backward, blood streaming from his nose, his medical bag scattering its contents across the floor. Syringes, vials of medication, and what looked like enough insulin to kill a horse spilled across the wooden planks. Duke lunged forward, not at Sarah's gun, but at the scattered drugs, his training recognizing the scent of dangerous substances. In the chaos, Sarah's pistol went off, the bullet splintering wood inches from Bill's head. "Enough!" Sarah screamed, steadying her aim with both hands. "Nathan, get up! We're doing this now!" But Pierce was struggling to his feet, his expensive confidence shattered along with his nose. Blood stained his white shirt, and his hands shook as he reached for a syringe. "Sarah, this has gotten out of hand. We need to leave. Regroup. Try again later." "There is no later." Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "They have recordings, evidence. It's now or never." The sound of an engine in the driveway made everyone freeze. Through the front windows, they could see Jake Morrison's pickup truck navigating the snowy path, his wife Carol visible in the passenger seat. Bill had called them the night before, asking them to come early for what he'd said was an important family discussion. Sarah's face went white as she realized their window of opportunity was closing. 2 more witnesses would make her plan impossible to execute cleanly. Pierce was already backing toward the rear door, his loyalty evaporating like morning mist. "Sarah, we leave now," Pierce hissed, pressing a blood-soaked handkerchief to his nose. "Cut our losses and disappear." "No!" Sarah swung the gun toward Pierce, her emotional control finally snapping completely. "I've spent 2 years setting this up, 2 years playing the devoted wife to a cripple. I am not walking away empty-handed." The gunshot that followed wasn't from Sarah's weapon. Maggie had reached the gun cabinet, her husband's old hunting rifle steady in her hands despite her age. The bullet caught Pierce in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the kitchen table. 30 years ago, I shot a man who threatened my family, Maggie said, her voice calm as mountain stone. "I've regretted a lot of things in my life, but that's not one of them." Jake Morrison's voice called out from the front porch. "Bill, everything okay in there? We heard gunshots?" Sarah's desperation reached a breaking point. With Pierce wounded and new witnesses arriving, her carefully planned execution was dissolving into chaos. She grabbed Bill's wheelchair handles, pointing her gun at the back of his head. "Everyone stays back," she shouted toward the front door. "I'll kill him right now if anyone comes closer." Duke moved with the speed and precision of his military training. The German Shepherd launched himself not at Sarah's gun hand, but at her ankles, his 75 pounds of muscle and bone sending her sprawling across the kitchen floor. The pistol skittered away under the refrigerator as Sarah hit the ground hard, her head striking the corner of the counter. For a moment, The kitchen was silent except for heavy breathing and the soft whimper Duke made as he limped away from Sarah's still form. Blood matted the fur on his left shoulder where Sarah's fingernails had raked him during their struggle. Jake Morrison burst through the front door, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a man who'd seen combat. Pierce groaning on the floor, Maggie standing over him with a rifle, Sarah unconscious by the refrigerator, and Bill sitting in his wheelchair with Duke pressed against his side. "Jesus Christ, Bill! What the hell happened here?" "My wife tried to kill me," Bill said simply, "and Duke saved my life." Carol was already on her phone with 911, her voice steady as she reported multiple gunshot victims and requested both police and ambulances. The professional competence of a woman who'd spent 20 years as a dispatcher kicked in automatically. As they waited for help to arrive, Bill ran his hands through Duke's fur, feeling the solid warmth of the only creature who'd never doubted, never betrayed, never stopped protecting him. The German shepherd's amber eyes looked up at him with the patient love that had sustained him through the darkest months of his recovery. Pierce regained consciousness as the first police sirens echoed through the mountains. His shoulder wound was messy but not life-threatening, and his eyes darted between the exits as if calculating escape routes. Blood loss and shock had stripped away his clinical confidence, leaving only a middle-aged man facing the consequences of his choices. "I want to make a deal," he gasped as the sirens grew louder. "I have information about other cases, other veterans. Sarah isn't the only one." Sarah stirred on the kitchen floor, her auburn hair matted with blood from her collision with the counter. When her eyes opened and focused on the faces surrounding her, the mask of loving wife was completely gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You have no idea what you've done," she said to Bill, her voice thick with concussion but clear with malice. "I know things about your family, about your mother, secrets that will destroy everything you think you know." Maggie's grip tightened on the rifle, her weathered face showing no emotion. "Some secrets are worth keeping buried, girl, and some people are worth protecting at any cost." The first police officer through the door was Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran who'd responded to domestic violence calls that ranged from simple arguments to attempted murder. She took one look at the scene and immediately called for backup, additional ambulances, and the county's crime scene unit. As paramedics worked on Pierce and Sarah, Detective Lieutenant Robert Hayes arrived to begin sorting through what would become one of the most complex criminal cases in Virginia mountain country history. Bill found himself giving a statement while Duke sat pressed against his wheelchair, the dog's presence the only thing keeping him anchored as his world continued to spin out of control. "We're going to need those recordings your mother mentioned," Detective Hayes said, his notebook already filling with details. "And we'll want to examine all the medications, run toxicology tests, check bank records. This is going to take time." Time. Bill realized he might finally have that luxury again. Time to heal, time to rebuild, time to understand how thoroughly he'd been betrayed by the woman he'd trusted with his life. 2 weeks after the kitchen confrontation, Sarah Elizabeth Morgan Thompson sat in the Rockingham County Jail wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her auburn hair look like flame against her pale skin. She'd been denied bail, the judge citing flight risk and the severity of charges that now included 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder in neighboring states. But Sarah wasn't finished. If she was going down, she intended to take the Thompson family's reputation with her. The meeting she requested was with Bill, and against his attorney's advice he came. Detective Hayes accompanied him to the sterile visiting room where Sarah sat behind reinforced glass, her hands cuffed to a chain around her waist. The woman who had once whispered sweet encouragements during his physical therapy now looked at him with undisguised hatred. "You look tired, darling," Sarah said, her voice carrying the mock concern she'd perfected during their marriage. Not sleeping well. Maybe you need some of Dr. Pierce's special medication. Bill forced himself to meet her eyes. What do you want, Sarah? To give you a wedding gift I never had the chance to share. Sarah's smile was sharp as winter ice. The truth about your precious family history, about your mother's little secret. Detective Hayes leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. Sarah had been hinting at additional information for days, always dancing around details, using them as bargaining chips in plea negotiations that her public defender insisted were futile. 30 years ago, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper, your father didn't die in a hunting accident. Your mother shot him deliberately, murdered him in cold blood while he slept. The words hit Bill like a physical blow. Through the glass, he could see Sarah savoring his reaction, feeding off his shock like a predator tasting blood. You're lying, Bill said, but his voice lacked conviction. He remembered his father as a distant, angry man who drank too much and spoke with his fists when the whiskey took hold. He remembered his mother's bruises, explained away as clumsiness or accidents. Most clearly, he remembered the relief that had settled over their cabin after Robert Thompson's funeral. Am I? Sarah reached into the pocket of her jumpsuit and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photocopy that shouldn't have been in her possession. I found this in your mother's bedroom while you were at physical therapy, hidden behind a family photo. Detective Hayes signaled to the guard who took the paper and passed it through the security slot. It was a confession letter, written in Maggie's careful handwriting and dated 31 years ago. Bill's hands shook as he read his mother's words describing years of abuse, her fear for her 12-year-old son's safety, and her decision to end the nightmare the only way she knew how. She drugged his whiskey with sleeping pills, Sarah said, watching Bill's face carefully. Then she shot him while he was unconscious. Made it look like he'd been cleaning his rifle when it accidentally discharged. The sheriff never investigated too closely. Everyone in the county knew what kind of man Robert Thompson was. The visiting room felt like it was closing in around Bill. His mother, the woman who'd raised him with stories of family honor and mountain values, was a killer, just like Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on him that Maggie had shot Dr. Pierce to protect her family, just as she'd once shot her husband. Why are you telling me this? Bill asked. Because I want you to understand something. Sarah leaned closer to the glass, her eyes bright with malicious satisfaction. Your mother and I are the same. We both killed to get what we wanted. The only difference is she got away with it. Detective Hayes spoke for the first time. Mrs. Thompson, are you confessing to additional crimes? Because if you have knowledge of other murders— I'm not confessing to anything, Sarah interrupted. I'm simply sharing family history. Of course, if the authorities wanted to reopen a 30-year-old case, they might find some interesting evidence, DNA on the rifle maybe, or they could talk to Dr. Marcus Webb, who was the attending physician when Robert Thompson was brought to the hospital. He's retired now, living in Florida, but his memory is still quite sharp. The threat was clear. Sarah was offering a devil's bargain, drop the charges against her, and she'd keep Maggie's secret buried. Pursue the case, and she'd ensure that his 71-year-old mother spent her remaining years in prison for a murder committed to protect her son. Bill stared at the confession letter, reading his mother's words over and over. She'd described herself as a woman with no choice, protecting the only good thing in my life from a man who would have killed us both eventually. The handwriting was younger, steadier, but unmistakably Maggie's. What do you want? Bill asked finally. Charges dropped, a quiet divorce, and $50,000 to help me start over somewhere new. Sarah's terms were delivered with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. In exchange, that letter disappears forever, and your mother gets to die peacefully in her own bed instead of a prison cell." Detective Hayes was already shaking his head. "Mr. Thompson, don't even consider this. Extortion is another felony charge, and we don't negotiate with—" "I need to talk to my mother," Bill interrupted. The drive back to the cabin was silent except for Duke's soft panting from the back seat of Jake Morrison's truck. Bill had asked his friend to drive because his hands were still shaking too badly to trust himself behind the wheel. The German Shepherd seemed to sense his distress, occasionally pressing his nose against Bill's shoulder in comfort. Maggie was waiting on the front porch, rocking in the chair her own mother had used decades earlier. At 71, she still looked strong enough to split firewood or wrestle a bear, but Bill could see new lines around her eyes, the weight of recent events settling into her weathered features. "You saw her," Maggie said. It wasn't a question. Bill handed her the confession letter without speaking. Maggie unfolded it slowly, her pale blue eyes scanning words she'd written in a different lifetime. When she finished reading, she folded it just as carefully and placed it in her lap. "I wondered when this would surface," she said quietly. 30 years of waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Is it true?" Bill asked, though he already knew the answer. "Every word." Maggie's voice carried no shame, no regret. "Your father was getting worse. The drinking, the anger. That last night he came home talking about teaching you a lesson, said you were getting too mouthy for a boy. He had his belt in his hand, and I knew if I didn't stop him, he was going to hurt you bad, maybe kill you." Bill closed his eyes, remembering that night. He'd been asleep when it happened, waking only to his mother's screams about an accident, the sheriff's car in their driveway, neighbors gathering with the morbid curiosity of people drawn to tragedy. "So you drugged his whiskey." "Crushed up sleeping pills from my prescription, waited until he passed out in his chair." Maggie's hands were steady as she spoke. "Then I took his rifle and put it to his head. Made it look like he'd been cleaning it drunk and it went off." "And Sheriff Morrison believed you?" Bill asked, thinking of Jake's father, who'd been the law in their county for 25 years. "Sheriff Morrison knew what kind of man your father was," Maggie said simply. "Half the county knew. He investigated enough to make it official, but he wasn't looking too hard for evidence that might complicate things." Duke had climbed the porch steps and laid down beside Maggie's rocking chair, his amber eyes moving between the two humans as if following their conversation. The German Shepherd had spent his life protecting people, and Bill wondered if the dog somehow understood the complex morality of what they were discussing. "Sarah wants $50,000 in drop charges," Bill said, "in exchange for keeping this secret." Maggie nodded slowly. "And what did you tell her?" "Nothing yet. I wanted to hear it from you first." "Well, you've heard it." Maggie reached down to scratch Duke's ears, her voice growing stronger. "Now you need to decide if you can live with having a killer for a mother." Bill looked at the woman who'd raised him alone, worked 2 jobs to keep their land, taught him the difference between right and wrong through example and sacrifice. He thought about the father he barely remembered, whose idea of discipline involved leather belts and closed fists. "You protected me," he said finally. "I protected us both. Then I'll protect you now." Maggie smiled for the first time in weeks. "What did you have in mind?" Bill's decision to call Sarah's bluff came with consequences he hadn't anticipated. 3 days after their jailhouse meeting, Sarah made good on her threat by contacting the Virginia State Police Cold Case Division through her attorney. Within 24 hours, Detective Sergeant Amanda Cross was sitting in the Thompson family cabin, examining the confession letter and asking questions that had been buried for 30 years. Detective Cross was a compact woman in her early 40s with graying brown hair and the patient demeanor of someone who specialized in old mysteries. She'd reopened dozens of cold cases during her 15-year career, finding justice for families who'd waited decades for answers. But this case was different. The victim had been violent. The killer was elderly, and the statute of limitations had long since expired for anything except murder. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Cross said gently, I need you to understand that anything you tell me today can be used in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. I don't need a lawyer to tell the truth, Maggie interrupted, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap. I killed my husband 30 years ago to protect my son. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to. The confession was methodical, detailed, and delivered without a trace of remorse. Maggie described years of escalating abuse, her growing fear that Robert would seriously injure or kill 12-year-old Bill, and her decision to end the threat permanently. She walked Detective Cross through every step of that December night, crushing sleeping pills into Robert's whiskey, waiting for him to pass out, positioning the rifle to make it look accidental. The sheriff at the time was Tom Morrison, Maggie said, Jake's father. He was a good man who understood what kind of monster Robert Thompson was. Tom investigated enough to satisfy the insurance company and the county coroner, but he wasn't looking to put a widow in prison for protecting her boy. Detective Cross took notes steadily, occasionally asking for clarification but never interrupting the flow of Maggie's narrative. When the elderly woman finished, the detective sat quietly for several minutes, weighing decades of experience against the confession she'd just heard. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, did Sarah Morgan Thompson have any evidence beyond this letter? Anything that might corroborate your account? She found the letter hidden behind a family photo, Bill said. But she claimed there might be other evidence, DNA on the rifle, maybe. She mentioned a doctor who was still alive. Detective Cross made a note. Dr. Marcus Webb. I spoke with him yesterday. He's 83 now, living in a retirement community in Sarasota. His memory of that night is quite clear. The words hung in the air like storm clouds. Bill felt Duke press against his wheelchair, the German shepherd's presence the only anchor in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath him. Doctor, Webb remembers your father being brought to the hospital with a gunshot wound to the head, Detective Cross continued, but he also remembers something else, bruises on your mother's arms and neck that were consistent with strangulation, fresh bruises that couldn't have happened after your father was already unconscious. Maggie's eyes widened. I never told anyone about that. About what, Mrs. Thompson? Robert came home that night angrier than I'd ever seen him. Said his foreman had fired him for showing up drunk again. He grabbed me by the throat, slammed me against the kitchen wall, said it was my fault for not keeping him in line. Maggie's voice grew quiet with memory. That's when he started talking about teaching Bill a lesson, too. Said maybe if he beat some sense into both of us, we'd learn to show him proper respect. Detective Cross leaned forward. So the bruises Dr. Webb documented were from earlier that evening before you drugged your husband's whiskey. I suppose so. I didn't even realize I was hurt until the next morning. Had fingerprint bruises around my neck for 2 weeks. Mrs. Thompson, those bruises change everything. They provide evidence of imminent threat, of a pattern of escalating violence. Combined with your son's testimony about your husband's behavior. I was 12, Bill interrupted. I was scared of him, but I never reported anything to anyone. But you remember the abuse? Bill closed his eyes, allowing memories he'd buried for decades to surface. His father's drunken rages, the sound of his mother crying behind their bedroom door, the way she'd wear long sleeves even in summer to hide fingerprint bruises on her arms. I remember, he said quietly. What followed was a week of investigation that felt like archaeological excavation of the Thompson family's darkest period. Detective Cross interviewed neighbors who recalled Robert Thompson's violent temper, former co-workers who remembered him as an angry drunk, and hospital staff who had treated Maggie for accidents throughout her marriage. The rifle that had supposedly killed Robert Thompson was still in evidence storage at the county sheriff's department, tagged and forgotten but still available for DNA analysis. The results were inconclusive. 30 years of storage had degraded most biological evidence, but what they did find supported Maggie's account. Sarah's gambit was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of destroying the Thompson family, her revelation had opened an investigation that painted Maggie as a victim who'd been driven to desperate measures by an abusive husband. Public opinion, filtered through local newspapers and social media, was overwhelmingly sympathetic to the elderly woman who'd protected her disabled son. The turning point came when Dr. Pierce, facing life in prison for his role in the attempted murder conspiracy, decided to cooperate fully with authorities. His confession revealed not just Sarah's involvement in the plot against Bill, but her history of targeting vulnerable veterans in multiple states. Sarah Morgan Thompson has been operating this scheme for at least 5 years, Detective Hayes announced during a press conference at the county courthouse. We've identified 7 potential victims across Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland. 3 are confirmed dead, 2 survived what we now believe were murder attempts, and 2 others are still under investigation. The revelation that Sarah was a serial killer who specialized in murdering disabled veterans sent shockwaves through the veteran community. The woman who'd presented herself as a dedicated caregiver had been systematically targeting the men and women she was supposed to heal. For Bill, the news brought a strange mixture of vindication and horror. Sarah's crimes dwarfed any moral complexity surrounding his mother's actions 30 years earlier. The woman he'd trusted with his life hadn't just betrayed him. She'd built an entire career around betraying men like him. But the personal cost was devastating. Bill found himself questioning everything about their relationship, wondering how much of Sarah's affection had been genuine and how much had been performance. The intimate moments they'd shared, the promises they'd made, the future they'd planned, all of it was contaminated by the knowledge of what she'd really been planning. Duke seemed to understand his master's emotional turmoil. The German shepherd stayed closer than usual, often placing his head on Bill's lap when the weight of betrayal became too heavy to bear alone. The dog's presence was a constant reminder that loyalty existed, even when it came in unexpected forms. The media attention surrounding the case brought reporters from across the country to the small Virginia mountain community. The Thompson family cabin became a focal point for stories about veteran abuse, domestic violence, and the lengths people would go to protect their families. Maggie handled the attention with the stoic grace of a mountain woman who'd survived 7 decades of hardship. She gave carefully worded interviews, acknowledging her past actions while emphasizing her commitment to protecting her son. The confession letter that Sarah had intended as blackmail became evidence of a mother's desperate love. "I'm not proud of what I did," Maggie told a reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, "but I won't apologize for protecting my child from a man who would have killed him. Any parent would understand." The statement resonated with viewers across the country, many of whom saw Maggie not as a killer, but as a protector who'd been failed by a system that should have intervened years earlier. Support letters poured in from other abuse survivors, veteran families, and people who understood the impossible choices that domestic violence sometimes demanded. But for all the public support, Bill knew that Sarah's revelations had changed their family forever. The secret Maggie had carried for 30 years was now public knowledge, and the weight of that exposure was visible in her increasingly frail appearance. As winter deepened in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Bill realized that Sarah's final victory might be the slow destruction of the woman who'd raised him, even from behind prison bars. The truth about Sarah's crimes began unraveling like a poisonous thread pulled from a tapestry of deception. 3 weeks after her arrest, FBI Special Agent Patricia Reeves arrived at the Thompson cabin carrying files that documented a killing spree spanning 5 states and 7 years. Sarah Elizabeth Morgan hadn't just targeted Bill, she'd perfected her method on a string of vulnerable veterans whose deaths had been written off as natural causes or suicide. "We've been tracking this pattern for 2 years, Agent Reeves explained, spreading crime scene photos and medical records across the kitchen table where Sarah had once prepared Bill's meals. The victims were all disabled veterans receiving substantial disability payments or life insurance. All had recent marriages to women with nursing backgrounds. All died within 18 months of remarriage. The first victim had been Thomas Bradley, a Marine who'd lost his leg in Iraq and married a nurse named Sarah Elizabeth Morrison in Tennessee. He'd died of an apparent insulin overdose, ruled accidental because he wasn't diabetic, and had no history of drug abuse. The second was James Patterson, an Army veteran with PTSD who married Sarah Elizabeth Hayes in Kentucky. His death from heart medication overdose was attributed to confusion about dosing. Bill studied the photographs of men who looked remarkably like him. Wounded veterans trying to rebuild their lives, trusting women who saw them as opportunities rather than human beings. Each had owned property, carried life insurance, received regular disability payments. Each had been systematically poisoned by wives who'd assumed different identities but shared the same calculating methodology. She changed her name and moved to new states between victims, Agent Reeves continued. Always targeted men through veteran support groups or VA hospitals. Always presented herself as a caring nurse looking for meaningful relationships. The pattern was perfect until she got greedy with you. The greed Agent Reeves referenced was the Thompson family land. Unlike her previous victims, who'd owned modest homes or apartments, Bill possessed property worth millions. Sarah had gotten impatient, sloppy, trying to accelerate her timeline because the potential payoff was larger than all her previous schemes combined. "Dr. Pierce has been cooperating fully," Agent Reeves said. "He's admitted to falsifying medical records for at least 4 of the victims. Sarah recruited him 3 years ago when she realized she needed medical credibility to make the deaths look natural." Pierce's confession had revealed the chilling efficiency of Sarah's operation. She would establish relationships with vulnerable veterans, marry them quickly, then begin gradual poisoning while Pierce provided false medical explanations for their declining health. When the men died, their deaths appeared to be complications of existing conditions rather than murder. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Reeves opened a final file folder. Inside were bank records showing that Sarah had been sending money to someone else, a partner who'd been helping coordinate her crimes from the beginning. "We arrested Dr. Marcus Webb yesterday at his retirement community in Florida," Agent Reeves announced. "He wasn't just a witness to your father's death 30 years ago. He was Sarah's mentor." The room went silent except for Duke's soft panting as the German shepherd lay protectively beside Bill's wheelchair. Maggie's face had gone pale, her weathered hands gripping the arms of her chair as the implications sank in. "Dr. Webb was the attending physician for all of Sarah's victims," Agent Reeves continued. "He'd been coaching her methods, providing medical expertise, even helping her identify targets through veteran medical networks. When she found your mother's confession letter, she contacted him about your family's history. The conspiracy was even more elaborate than anyone had imagined. Dr. Webb had been using his position in veteran health care to identify potential victims, men with substantial assets, limited family support, and medical conditions that could mask poisoning symptoms. He'd then introduced these men to Sarah through seemingly casual encounters at hospitals or support groups. Dr. Webb told us something else," Agent Reeves said, her voice growing gentle. "About the night your father died, Mrs. Thompson." Maggie straightened in her chair, preparing for another devastating revelation. "What about it?" "Dr. Webb kept detailed notes from that night, notes that were never included in the official report. Your husband didn't die from a gunshot wound to the head, he died from a drug overdose. The sleeping pills you gave him were enough to kill him within an hour. When you shot him, he was already dead. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. For 30 years, she'd lived with the belief that she'd killed her husband in cold blood, that she was a murderer who'd escaped justice through luck and a sympathetic sheriff. Now she was learning that Robert Thompson had died from the sleeping pills, not the gunshot wound she'd inflicted on his corpse. "You didn't murder your husband, Mrs. Thompson," Agent Reeves said quietly. "You gave him what you thought was a sedative, then staged a shooting to cover up what you believed was murder. But the autopsy, Doctor Webb performed showed death by drug overdose, not gunshot trauma." Bill reached for his mother's hand, feeling the tremor in her weathered fingers as she processed 30 years of unnecessary guilt. The confession letter that had haunted her, the secret that Sarah had used as blackmail, was based on a misunderstanding of what had actually happened that night. "But I shot him," Maggie whispered. "I put that rifle to his head and pulled the trigger." "You shot a dead man," Agent Reeves replied. "Dr. Webb falsified his report to make it look like a hunting accident, probably because he understood why you'd done what you thought you had to do. But you were never actually a killer, Mrs. Thompson." The revelation should have brought relief, but Maggie looked more confused than comforted. Then why did Dr. Webb help Sarah? If he was willing to protect me 30 years ago, "Because he wasn't protecting you," Agent Reeves said grimly. "He was protecting himself, Dr. Webb had been slowly poisoning patients for decades, collecting on life insurance policies as a beneficiary. Your husband was one of his victims, not yours. Webb used your guilt about the staged shooting to keep you quiet about his real crimes." The scope of Dr. Webb's criminal career was staggering. For 40 years, he'd been systematically murdering patients while maintaining a reputation as a caring, small-town physician. Robert Thompson had been an early victim, a violent drunk whose death would raise few questions. Webb had seen Maggie's desperate attempt to cover up what she thought was murder as perfect camouflage for his own crime. "Sarah contacted Dr. Webb after she found your confession letter," Agent Reeves explained. "She thought she'd discovered evidence of a murder she could use for blackmail. Instead, she'd stumbled onto his oldest secret." Webb realized Sarah could expose his entire operation, so he recruited her as a partner instead of risking her as an enemy. Duke suddenly stood up, hackles raised, growling toward the front door. Through the window they could see a news van pulling into the driveway, followed by 2 more vehicles carrying reporters who'd caught wind of the FBI investigation. The Thompson family's private tragedy was about to become national news. "I need to prepare you for what's coming," Agent Reeves said. "This story is going to be everywhere. Serial killer nurse, corrupt doctor, decades of veteran murders. It has everything the media loves. Your family's going to be at the center of it." Bill looked at his 71-year-old mother, who just learned that 30 years of guilt had been based on a lie, and at Duke, who'd been the only one to see through Sarah's deception from the beginning. The German Shepherd had tried to warn them for months, his canine instincts recognizing danger that human intelligence had missed. "What happens now?" Bill asked. "Sarah and Dr. Webb will both face federal charges for conspiracy to commit murder across state lines," Agent Reeves replied. "Dr. Pierce will likely cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, and you'll all need to testify when this goes to trial." The media circus that followed was everything Agent Reeves had predicted, and worse. News trucks lined the mountain road leading to the Thompson cabin, reporters shouted questions whenever anyone emerged, and helicopters circled overhead capturing aerial footage of the property where it had all begun. But the most unexpected development came when families of Dr. Webb's other victims began reaching out to the Thompsons. These were people who'd lost loved ones over the decades to what they'd believed were natural deaths or medical complications. Learning that their family members had been murdered brought a mixture of grief and vindication that Bill recognized from his own experience. Sarah's final gambit had failed spectacularly. Instead of destroying the Thompson family with revelations about Maggie's past, she'd exposed a conspiracy that dwarfed anything they could have imagined. The woman who'd tried to isolate and manipulate Bill had inadvertently connected him to a community of survivors who understood betrayal on a scale he'd never imagined. As winter began to break in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Bill realized that the truth, however painful, had finally set them all free. 6 months after Sarah's arrest, the Blue Ridge Mountains had settled back into their ancient rhythm of seasons, though the Thompson family cabin bore little resemblance to the quiet retreat it had once been. The media attention had transformed their property into an unlikely pilgrimage site for veteran families, abuse survivors, and people seeking stories of redemption that seemed increasingly rare in modern America. Bill sat on the wraparound porch in his wheelchair, Duke's massive head resting on his lap as they watched the sunset paint the Virginia mountains in shades of gold and amber. The German shepherd had gained back the weight he'd lost during the crisis, his coat gleaming with health and his amber eyes bright with contentment. At 8 years old, Duke was entering his senior years, but his devotion to Bill remained as fierce as ever. The trial had ended 3 weeks earlier with verdicts that brought justice but little satisfaction. Sarah Elizabeth Morgan Thompson received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of veterans Thomas Bradley, James Patterson, and Michael Rodriguez. Dr. Marcus Webb, at 83, was sentenced to life in prison, where he would likely die behind bars. Dr. Nathan Pierce, in exchange for his cooperation, received 25 years and would be eligible for parole when he was 70. "They're calling it the Angel of Death case," Maggie said, settling into the rocking chair beside Bill. At 71, she looked younger than she had in years. The weight of 30 years of guilt finally lifted from her shoulders. The revelation that she hadn't actually killed her husband, that Robert Thompson had died from Dr. Webb's poison, not her sleeping pills, had transformed her from a woman carrying a terrible secret into a survivor of one of the longest-running serial killing sprees in American history. The media had dubbed Sarah the Angel of Death for her systematic targeting of disabled veterans, though Bill thought the nickname gave her too much dignity. She was simply a predator who had perfected the art of exploiting trust, using her medical training and false compassion to murder men who'd already sacrificed so much for their country. But from the devastating betrayal had come unexpected blessings. The publicity surrounding the case had led to policy changes at VA hospitals nationwide, with new protocols for monitoring veteran patients and investigating suspicious deaths. A foundation established in memory of Sarah's victims was providing support for disabled veterans and their families. Most importantly for Bill, the attention had brought someone special into his life. Dr. Emily Chen had arrived at the cabin 2 months earlier, not as a reporter or investigator, but as a trauma counselor specializing in veteran family recovery. She'd been assigned by the VA to help the Thompson family process their experiences, but her visits had evolved into something much more personal. Emily was 38. With straight black hair she wore in a practical ponytail and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd lost her own brother, an Army medic, to suicide after 3 tours in Afghanistan, and her dedication to helping veteran families came from a deep understanding of their unique challenges. "She's good for you," Maggie had observed after Emily's 3rd visit, when Bill's laughter at something the therapist had said carried clearly across the mountain air. "Different from before." Different was an understatement. Where Sarah had been calculating and manipulative, Emily was genuine and transparent. Where Sarah had isolated Bill from his family and friends, Emily encouraged him to strengthen those connections. Most telling of all, Duke adored Emily, greeting her with tail wags and gentle nudges that demonstrated the German Shepherd's approval. "Trust the dog," Jake Morrison had advised during one of his frequent visits. Duke saw through Sarah from day one. If he likes Emily, she's good people. The relationship had developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect, rather than the whirlwind romance that had characterized Bill's courtship with Sarah. Emily understood trauma both as a professional and as someone who'd lived through devastating loss. She didn't see Bill's wheelchair as a limitation or his disability as something to overcome, but simply as one aspect of a complex, intelligent, and deeply caring man. "I have something to tell you," Emily said as she joined Bill and Maggie on the porch, carrying a manila folder that had become a familiar sight during her visits. "The VA wants to offer you a position." Bill raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Training service dogs for veterans. Specifically training dogs to detect medical tampering and recognize signs of caregiver abuse." Emily sat on the porch steps, automatically reaching out to scratch Duke's ears. "Your story has inspired a whole new approach to veteran protection services." The irony wasn't lost on Bill. Duke's instinctive recognition of Sarah's deception had saved not just his life, but potentially the lives of countless other veterans. The German Shepherd's behavior during those months of gradual poisoning, refusing to eat when Sarah was present, knocking medication from Bill's hands, positioning himself as a barrier between Bill and his wife, had been a masterclass in protective awareness. Duke would be the lead instructor, Emily continued, teaching other dogs to recognize the signs he picked up on. It's pioneering work that could revolutionize veteran safety protocols. Maggie smiled, her weathered face crinkling with pride. "That dog's going to be famous." Duke's tail thumped against the porch boards as if he understood the conversation. The German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity in veteran circles, featured in magazines and documentaries as an example of the unbreakable bond between warriors and their four-legged partners. "There's something else," Emily said, her voice growing softer. "The VA wants to name the new Veteran Protection Program after your family, the Thompson-Duke Initiative for Veteran Safety." Bill felt tears prick his eyes as the full weight of their journey settled over him. From the devastating betrayal that had nearly cost him his life, something beautiful and meaningful was emerging. His name and Duke's would be forever linked to protecting other veterans from the kind of predators who had targeted them. "I think Dad would have liked that," Bill said, surprising himself by speaking of Robert Thompson without the usual weight of complicated emotions. Learning that his father had been Dr. Webb's victim rather than his mother's had somehow freed Bill to remember the man before alcohol, and whatever poison Webb had administered had twisted him into something violent and unpredictable. As the sun continued its descent behind the mountains, other visitors arrived for what had become a weekly gathering. Jake and Carol Morrison came first, followed by several veteran families who'd found community and healing through their shared connection to the Thompson story. Dr. Pierce's former patients, who'd survived Sarah's early poisoning attempts, had become like extended family. The porch that had once echoed with Sarah's false laughter now filled with genuine conversation, the sound of children playing in the yard, and the contented sighs of Duke and two other German Shepherds who'd joined their informal pack. The cabin that had been a crime scene was now a sanctuary. "Speech!" called out Tommy Rodriguez, the son of one of Sarah's victims, as more cars arrived carrying people who'd found hope in the Thompson family's survival. "Tell us about the foundation." Bill had indeed started a foundation using the life insurance money that Sarah had tried so hard to claim. The Thomas Thompson Foundation for Veteran Family Safety provided funding for service dog training, caregiver background checks, and support services for families dealing with trauma and abuse. "We've placed 47 service dogs in the past 3 months," Bill announced to the gathering crowd. Each one trained using Duke's methods for detecting deception and protecting their veteran partners. Duke raised his head proudly, as if understanding his role in the expanding mission. The German Shepherd, who'd once been just Bill's companion, was now the patriarch of a new generation of protector dogs, his offspring and trainees carrying on his legacy of unwavering loyalty. As the evening progressed, Emily moved closer to Bill's wheelchair, her hand finding his with the natural ease of two people who'd found something real together. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Maggie, whose eyes sparkled with the knowledge that her son had finally found someone worthy of his trust. "You know," Emily said quietly, "when I first heard about your case, I thought it was just another tragedy, another veteran who'd been failed by the system." "And now?" Bill asked. "Now I think it's a love story." Emily's eyes moved between Bill and Duke, then settled on the gathering of people whose lives had been touched by their experience. The love between a man and his dog, the love of a mother willing to carry guilt for 30 years to protect her son, the love of friends who refused to give up. "And maybe," she added with a shy smile, "the love of two people who found each other because they both understand that trust is something you earn, not something you assume." Bill squeezed her hand as Duke's tail continued its steady rhythm against the porch boards. Around them, the community they'd inadvertently created continued its evening celebration of survival, resilience, and the kind of loyalty that could weather any storm. As the first stars appeared in the Virginia sky, Bill realized that Sarah's attempt to destroy his life had instead led him to discover what it truly meant to live. Sometimes the greatest betrayals could become the foundation for the deepest trust, and the darkest moments could illuminate the brightest possibilities. Duke opened one amber eye, looked at his human, and settled back into contented sleep, his duty done and his family safe. Sometimes life breaks us in ways we never expected, but it's in those shattered moments that we discover who truly stands by our side. Bill Thompson learned this truth the hardest way possible, betrayed by the woman he trusted most, saved by the loyal dog who never wavered. At 42, paralyzed and vulnerable, Bill could have given up when his world crumbled. Instead, he found strength in the unwavering love of Duke, his German shepherd, and the fierce protection of his 71-year-old mother, Maggie. Their story reminds us that real love doesn't count the cost. It doesn't measure what you can give back or calculate the burden you might become. Duke didn't see a disabled veteran. He saw his human who needed protection. Maggie didn't see a son requiring care. She saw a family worth defending. And eventually, Bill found Emily, a woman who saw past his wheelchair to the heart of a man worth loving. In our golden years, when health fails and trust becomes precious, we learn that loyalty isn't just a virtue, it's everything. The people and pets who stay when staying gets hard, they're our real treasure. What companion in your life has shown you unconditional loyalty? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.